Hello and welcome to another episode of New Narratives Political Agenda with me, PJ Thum. I am wearing a blue and orange batik shirt, sitting with two other people in front of a black table and in front of a map of Southeast Asia, and my pronouns are he, him. And today, joining us, Kokila Annamalai. Did I pronounce that right?
It's okay. It'll do.
Should I do it again?
It's okay.
Okay. The very forgiving Kokila, who is very awesome and will be joining us on the podcast today. Before we go on, as always, if you enjoy this podcast, please do join New Narrative as a member to support the creation of more of these at newnarrative.com/join, or you can donate at newnarrative.com/donate. If you'd like to learn more about New Narrative, please visit newnarrative.com/hello. And now, Subhash.
Stay where you are. We've come way too far. Where you think that you're gonna go? This is utopia. Please stay where you are. We've come way too far.
Okay, so welcome to the show, Kokila. Very good to have you back. I think this is your second time on the show. And of course, joining us as always, Editor-in-Chief of Wake Up Singapore, Sean Francis Han. How are you, Sean?
Hi, yeah. Really excited to get into this episode. We're going to be talking about the death penalty. We're going to be talking about community organization. We're going to be talking about a lot of interesting things. And that's because we've got a really interesting guest here who's been one of the long-standing figures in Singapore civil society. But before that, I'm wearing a white striped t-shirt and my pronouns are he, him. So Kokila, thank you so much for joining us and speaking to us. Let's get into it. Who are you? Not to bring in an existential question, but how would you describe yourself? Because you've worn many hats in your career as an activist, but how would you describe yourself?
I can't imagine the activism scene without Koki in it. For as long as I've been an activist, you've been there, like, you know, you're a rock.
Constant.
A constant, yeah.
Yeah, but how would you describe yourself? Because you've been in so many different roles.
Okay, so hello, I'm Koki, and I'm wearing a green kurta, and my pronouns are she, her. Okay, so I think I remember, the question you asked brings to mind an anecdote that I've always found quite endearing, if I might say so myself, which is that when I first joined AWARE, straight out of college, actually, they hired me for the role of communications executive, and I was like, can my name card say activist? Because I don't want it to be I don't want it to be a job in the sense of any other job, and I want it to remember the political nature of my work and think of the functions we do as a secondary thing to the issues we care about, right?
Yeah.
And the orientations we have towards social justice work. And I remember that my boss was really amused, and she was like, "Sure, you can call it, you can call yourself whatever you want." And yeah, but I think that's it's shifted over the years. I think I would describe myself as a community organizer, as a facilitator, as a researcher and writer, in varying contexts, and because I've come to find the term activist not necessarily always clear or descriptive of the kind of labor we do and the ways in which we're engaged in social justice work.
So how did you get into activism? What was the spark or the impetus that pushed you into it?
So when I was in university studying sociology, I think it helped to clarify and crystallize a lot of the things I had always believed in but didn't have the language for, and helped me to find a way to talk about power and structures and systemic issues. So I think that was a really helpful orientation to have. And then I had my, I guess, political awakening while I was in university through discovering more about Operation Spectrum and Operation Cold Store.
Oh, wow.
And
Did they expose you to that?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, but we did have a human rights module, and one of the assignments was to interview an activist. So I actually reached out to Seelan on Facebook, who was with the anti-death penalty campaign. And I didn't know him, but I was like, hey, I have an assignment. Can I talk to you? And then we had coffee. And so, that was a really helpful, I think, initial conversation to understand what human rights work in Singapore could look like and what had been done. Because, Seelan was really helpful and nurturing. And then I think through my conversations with him and just looking things up on my own, I discovered more about the detentions of political political detentions in our in our past, right? And also then relatedly about labor unions and how so much of we had such a rich history of activism, right? And of movement building in Singapore in the past. So I think that was a really important point. And then I also went to India for a year. I took a gap year to work in rural development in Tamil Nadu. And that was I think a really also defining experience in that I could experience, I think, for the first time, what was possible in a democratic environment in terms of people coming together and making their own decisions. And I was organizing with Dalit communities. And just the amount of change that was possible to bring about when people had the space to assemble, organize, associate, and speak freely and imagine alternatives for themselves and push for it was really remarkable. And whether it was using think theater or other kinds of really creative forms of resistance and movement building, I think that was really enriching. So I think those were all different points of greater understanding and clarification for me on the things I cared about and wanted to work for. And so when I came back to Singapore, I finished college and then was looking for a job in human rights. And I was very optimistic. And I was just started going to civil society events and meeting people. And that's how I found out about an opening at Aware, and I guess the rest is history.
The rest is history. But so, fast forward till now, right? You're kind of, I guess I would loosely describe you as a career activist, right? Because you've been in the scene for really, really long. You're doing this professionally. And I think a lot of people that we've interviewed on the show, and myself included, right? We're kind of doing this on the side. I spend most of my time focusing on school still. And then activism is kind of on the side. But for you, it's a full-time thing. It's a full-time job. So how would you describe that? How has that been? How has that been for you?
So I wouldn't actually describe myself as a professional activist or a career activist because, I'm a bit uncertain about what those terms imply about this work, right? And while I have had full-time jobs within civil society organizations, I was at Aware first, and then I was at Beyond Social Services for 2 years. And I do think that the work I've done as an activist has largely been outside of those jobs. So whether it was organizing around access to justice or civil liberties, or the whether it was the train protest or a lot of the things that I've participated in over the years have been outside of being part of a professional organization. And while I definitely value and I'm really grateful for the jobs I've had and the things I've learned in those settings, I've also found it to be highly limiting in terms of activist work. And I really do feel that activism is something that everyone can participate in, and that it doesn't have to be or shouldn't be a job. Because I think especially in Singapore, I have concerns about the limits of doing social justice work within institutional settings because of how funding works and how that delimits a lot of the actions that are possible by NGOs, because the state controls so much of capital and also is so authoritarian and not just through controlling capital, right, but through laws and policies that can restrict the activities of societies or the activities of organizations. It's I have found it deeply frustrating and to work within organizations in here. I think so. I think that movement building also needs a much broader perspective than a professionalized NGO sector. I think that the most meaningful change comes from people coming together as citizens. And when I say citizens, I don't mean people who, have a red passport or a pink IC, but that they are people who live here, right, and care and have a stake in the society. But when people come together, not as professionals, not as professionals or clients or beneficiaries or consumers, but just as citizens, right? And I think that kind of mass mobilization is important for transformation. I think some incremental changes are possible through institutionalized work, but because we always have to work within the parameters set by the state, as long as you're institutionalized, unless you can find, very creative ways to resist that and work around that, which I think there are very few to no examples of here yet. I do think that it's and also I think for inclusion, right? Because how many people are going to be able to do this work as a full-time job? So I think for it to be accessible and for it to be framed as something that we all do as people who have a stake in this society and who care, and in different ways and forms, I do think that it needs to be de-linked from professional work. I think that, and also that's why I've learned to also see my work in terms of the specific forms of labor I do, like as a community organizer, right? Or as a writer or as a researcher. And I support like movement building work through these functions, but I don't find activist helpful enough as a description anymore because it seems to describe a certain politics rather than your labor, if that makes sense.
So give me some insight here on like what's life like as a quote unquote career activist, as in you're gonna
keep using that term, aren't you?
Well, okay, let's
I think because you want to break it down, right? You're saying it's insufficient to describe. So what exactly do you do? I think that's what Sean's getting at.
I'm just teasing.
No. I mean, I'm quite interested in like, can you what's the financial situation here? Can you make ends meet? Like, is there a sense of instability? Is there a sense in which, sometimes your parents ask questions or your family asks questions about, where your career is going, things like that. So I want to sort of know on the personal level, what's it like being a full-time activist?
Yeah, so it is definitely very insecure. I haven't had a full-time job in about 2 years now, since I left Beyond. And yeah, so it's been a uphill task, I think, trying to figure out how to I guess earn a living wage that can support me even in a bare minimum sense and my family. So it's been an interesting challenge. I think I was initially very demoralized by it because I've also had so many experiences of applying to jobs and then having it go quite far in terms of like the interview and them seeming really interested and encouraging, and then it always gets stopped towards the end because of a security check or something, because of my politics, right? And because the government is not fond of me. so there's a lot of jobs, whether full-time or part-time or even freelance work, project-based work that you would imagine, because it's a contract level, that's not going to be a security check. But you'd be surprised, right? And it's not just like civil service jobs or anything like that, right? But even and not in NGO jobs or even jobs in publishing, anywhere, in so many spaces, it's been blocked by the state. So that's yeah, I think it was extremely disheartening for a while, and now I've been trying to be more optimistic. I don't know how else to. I mean, I've got a few different small gigs. I wouldn't say that I am yet able to earn a living wage, but I think freelance work takes time to figure out too. So, and also trying to balance it with making sure that that work is also work that builds towards the kind of social justice efforts I'm interested in. Right?
How's your family in this? So are they supportive? Are they sort of curious about it? What's the family situation here like?
Well, my family here is just my partner and my mother.
Okay.
My partner is of course extremely supportive, and she is also in civil society, and that's how we met. So my mother is, I think she's evolved her position over the years. I think she used to be a lot more anxious about me getting into trouble and about me earning a living wage. But I think she's increasingly proud of the work I do, which is, I don't think, it's not like we've had conversations about it directly. I think that just from the way she talks about it, and she'll be like, oh, I shared your article with my friends, or today somebody told me that they read something you wrote and that you're, and I'm so proud. So it's just kind of been an interesting shift, but she's still very anxious about mostly me getting into trouble.
But I think that sounds like a mom thing. Like they're always just going to be anxious about everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, I want to kind of pick back up on something that you said just now, which was that, you made a very interesting argument about how when it comes to the professionalization of activism, right, the state holds the capital. They hold the coin purse here, right? So they get to decide which NGOs they want to support. It's very limiting vis-a-vis the work that you do within the organization, the NGO. How then do we conceive of where we should go in terms of activism? Because in my head, for the longest time, I thought, well, wouldn't it be a nice idea if all the NGOs were just properly funded and we could all just be career activists? Because activists are on the ground. They know the situation. They know what's going down, right? Why couldn't we have that? And then, so you're kind of challenging that narrative that I've kind of implicitly assumed all this time, which is that the professionalization of activism is a good thing. So can you maybe speak more about that sort of, why couldn't we imagine of, the state kind of being like, yeah, we're just going to give money to activists. You guys know the scene. You do it, right? What's wrong with that model?
I mean, it's not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that model, but that's not our context, right? The state is not, we don't live in a democratic society where the state is going to give funding to organizations to critique it and to resist it, right? Which is what happens in many other contexts too, right? Like state funding is available for even very critical actors of the state. And also in many other contexts there are independent sources of funding available. Yeah. And I think that, because we don't have that here in that kind of, grant makers or corporates are definitely also often trying to be compliant to state regulations and the state's interests. It's very difficult to take a position that is independent of the state if you are accepting funding from any major body. So I think that decentralized movement building is a powerful and valuable way of doing this work that we should be exploring more of, and I'm really encouraged to see more of that recently here.
So if I can sum, you're basically saying you're not against professional activism in theory. You're wary of it in the Singapore context, in practice in Singapore, because professionalization means sources of funding, and the vast majority, if not all sources of funding, are in some way controlled or influenced by the government, which is opposed to any form of activism which wants to create genuine change.
Yes, to a large degree, though I do think that it's a nuanced thing, right? And I I'm also mindful of the NGO industrial complex that exists even in democratic
okay.
societies, right? This idea that once you become institutionalized, then you become much more invested in your own identity and survival rather than in the fluidity that movement building requires and the openness to change, and where you stay invested in communities and in people rather than in yourself, because of the fact that we're NGOs also operate in a capitalist society and environment, and it's quite easy to get invested in your own brand and building that up, and then because and then when you're invested in your own existence over communities, that can be a real detriment, I think, to the kind of transformative work we need to see.
I think I understand. I mean, this is a sort of a theme of the podcast that Sean and I have done together about sustainability of movements, where if you manage to professionalize and bureaucratize, it becomes a movement which is then able to sustain itself, because part of the responsibility, the incentives of the people in the movement is to keep their paycheck coming, so they will keep the movement going. But then the question is, where is that paycheck coming from? And if it's coming from external funders, you become more oriented towards serving the needs of external funders and their KPIs rather than the needs of the people.
Exactly. Exactly.
If I can give a concrete example, one of the tensions that New Narrative faces, right? We deliberately chose not to have advertising because we didn't want to have advertisers as the people we serve, right? When you're a media company with advertising, your funder is the advertiser. The product you're giving them are your readers' information. So we chose to have a membership-based revenue model where people support New Narrative by joining as members. But we've also found there's still a tension because our members are overwhelmingly from a certain background of people who are more affluent. They spend time online. They are comfortable paying for stuff online. They're familiar with the internet. And that's great, and we love our members, but at the same time we also and they're from all around the world, right? We have members, a lot more of our members outside of Singapore. We're not a Singapore organization, if I can remind everyone, even though we have a lot of Singapore members, but the people we want to serve are Southeast Asians whose voices may not necessarily get heard in the mainstream media. We want to look at issues which are not normally covered, which governments don't want covered, issues which transcend boundaries and borders, issues which are very complicated. And so there's a constant tension between who we're serving, and who we're reporting on, and I think that tension would then exist for every NGO, even if you're funded through a membership where the people your sources of funding are not necessarily the people you're directly trying to help. Even if there's a lot of overlap, the fact that it's not one for one will still create tension.
Yes, exactly. And there are models where NGOs or just organizations, let's say, are built by people who are the ones who are most impacted by the issues that the organization is trying to change, right? So, like a domestic workers organization of domestic workers that is pushing for domestic workers' rights. Those things are, that way of organizing exists a lot more in some other contexts. But again, here we see that, a lot of marginalized communities and vulnerable groups are not yet able to organize and get funding or support in the same way. And so there's always a proxy NGO of we serve you, right? Rather than that we are organizing for ourselves, and which is, the kind of mutual aid efforts or movement building efforts that I think we need to invest more of our people's resources in. So when I say that, it doesn't need to be professionalized, I don't mean to undermine the need for resources for this work, right? Because I think, Sean, you were saying that this is work that is labor and should be paid. And I very much resonate with that. But I think that we also need to be creative about how we resource this work, and that whether it's, crowdsourcing or having small contributions from people who are the people who these issues most affect, and so that they can make decisions about how things go forward, and it's also sustained by them, right? And and I think informal fundraising from people with capital, but who are committed to the principles of your work is also a route that is increasingly important to explore.
So your work now is more, it's more decentralized, it's more deprofessionalized. You're working with the Transformative Justice Collective and Community Classroom, right? But before this, you were with Aware and Beyond Social Services, which are more, leaning towards the institutional side. So, we've talked a lot about sort of the weaknesses or the things that we need to be careful about and wary about when it comes to institutions. But what were some of the opportunities that working with an institution like Aware or Beyond Social Services offered you?
Definitely a lot of skills, right?
Okay.
In whether in organizing or running an event, organizing a campaign, in doing research, in facilitation, right? Which I think is a really crucial skill that community organizers and activists it's valuable for them to have. So I think I learned a lot of skills from those spaces. I also learned a lot about what was not comfortable for me.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean? So I that sounds like a backhanded type of thing, but I really mean it sincerely in that I think I found myself in many places I've worked in pushing at the boundaries of what was seen as acceptable for us to do. And I think those tensions revealed to me and clarified for me a lot about what it is that I really want to commit my time and energy to and my labor to. Does that make sense?
It does. Can you be a little bit more specific? Because I'm very curious here, but what was that? This sounds like we're on the verge of something quite interesting here. What was it that you were not sort of comfortable with? What was that realization, if you can concretize that a bit?
So I think that because of the highly authoritarian environment we live in, where and so much of this authoritarian sentiment is deeply internalized, right, into individuals and organizations. So I think the kind of self-censorship that organizations very unspokenly exercise made me quite concerned, I think, because I think that one of the things that's also troubling to me is that often in NGOs, it's not very reflexive, right? Where you're able to say, actually, this is what we believe in and want to say, but we would get into trouble for. And so we're going to compromise and say this or do this and take this action instead of this action. And we're going to stay uncomfortable with that gap and try to bridge it.
Yeah.
That to me is still a workable position.
Yeah.
It's a reflexive position, right?
Yeah.
Because you're kind of staying aware of the values that you're committed to, of the reasons that you started doing this work, and then you're kind of mindful of the boundaries so that you don't get your work shut down so fast, and you make some trade-offs, right, to survive in this environment, which is something I have a lot of sympathy for. But I think staying critical of those compromises is crucial. And I think what is but I think it's really uncomfortable for people to constantly recognize that they're not doing what they really believe in or is really transformative. So over time, when we start to, instead of staying uncomfortable with that gap, when we start to justify these compromises and align our values with the compromises. So I think it's that's your ideal, and then this is what you can do right now without getting into trouble.
Yeah.
You need to be constantly saying, how do you get there, right? What are creative ways to get there? But instead, in a lot of spaces, things shift this way.
You shift the ideal down.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then this becomes what you're committed to. And then you also become intolerant of and exercise, I think, a lot of the same forms of persecution the state does towards people in your community and in your staff, in your organization, who are aspiring to that.
Yeah.
Right? And then the same kind of gaslighting that the state does, NGOs do, where they tell you that, you are you are self-serving as an activist for speaking up about things that are the state's not ready to hear. You know, you are you're just trying to serve your own interests and you're selfish rather than caring for the marginalized communities that you serve in. And then it becomes a really, like, I think psychologically, I think it took a real toll on me, having to not just make those compromises, which I think is something I can reason with, but being censured for asking questions or pushing at the boundaries of why we can't do certain things, and then that being framed as a moral high ground, right? That these compromises are in fact the moral high ground, that this is playing the long game, this is being strategic, this is, you know, being patient, and you're just, you know, and when you ask questions or when you push things too far in a direction that might make the state uncomfortable, I think if the conversation stayed, you know, that is, we wish we could do that, but because the state is so punitive, we can't. That's still fine, but it doesn't stay there, right? Because people are not comfortable with accepting that they're always making compromises, then they start to censure you in other ways, in the same way that the state does, by saying that you're not what's the word? Like, you know, you don't actually care about the communities and the people, and you're just opposing for the sake of opposing, or I think that's
I
the
can
real
imagine
pain point.
that's very traumatic. You know, I would imagine that, you know, you're coming into this place which you think is a safe space, which should be a safe space, and you kind of see how the values and the ideals begin to slip, and you get gaslit, and then how do you even respond? Because you kind of know, okay, they're just responding in a way that people tend to respond to structural issues that are deeply ingrained and entrenched. Oh my God. Okay, yeah. So that's a side of activism that, you know, I think that's the side that unfortunately is less pretty, a little bit more ugly than a lot of us think or know about. But nonetheless, you know, you've sort of moved out of that. You've started your own thing. You're now working on Community Classroom SG and Transformative Justice Collective. So can you tell us a little bit more about those two initiatives?
Sure. Okay. So with Community Classroom SG, we actually started out as a collective that wanted to focus on social justice education and social justice in education, right? But it's evolved, I think, over time to be more of a public education and political education kind of platform, where we do teach-ins from time to time on different human rights and social justice issues, and hope to do it in a way that is democratic and invites everyone to engage as peers, because it's really difficult here to influence the education system, right? As you know, so I think it's valuable to create platforms outside of it that people can turn to learn about sociopolitical issues, and I think that's one of the focuses. The other emphasis of Community Classroom is in bridging community development work with social justice work, and that's actually why I joined Beyond, because I thought that the way that Beyond activated communities and worked with people on the ground, people in vulnerable circumstances, and in a way that enabled their decision making and their leadership and their assets, was really profound and valuable, and not yet a practice that a lot of activists used. So to me, it was really important to bridge that kind of practice of organizing communities that we are part of and communities that we care about, organizing with them, right? And bringing people together so that their wisdom is tapped on for social change. So I think Community Classroom is also, like, I run some workshops from time to time on community development from a social justice perspective, because I think the community development space has been very depoliticized, the same way that social work has been very depoliticized in Singapore. So I guess this is also an effort on my part to repoliticize it, right? And think about community development work and asset-based community organizing work from a social justice and human rights perspective. So that's that. And then Transformative Justice Collective is looking at the criminal justice system in Singapore and reforms to that, as well as building transformative justice practices and skills within the collective,
Yeah.
so that we can be a resource for communities and people who are looking for alternative ways to address harm from
Yep.
turning to the criminal justice system, right? If they're looking for restorative or transformative ways to address harm that's been caused to them or in their community, there are very few resources in Singapore currently for people to turn to. And I think it's very difficult to ask people to critique or reject a system without offering alternatives. So I think to us it's as important to build up our practices and processes and skills
Yeah.
and capacity for these alternatives and experiment with creating the world we want to see, as much as we're resisting and pushing back on the things that we think are harmful and need to change about the system. Yeah.
Can I just ask, for the sake of our audience, if you can help us define? You've used a whole bunch of terms: community development, asset-based community development work, community organization. I think these are very abstract concepts.
Sorry. Very jargon, right?
Yeah, well, it's okay. So maybe you can just explain in practical terms what they are.
Sure. So, community organizing work is essentially bringing communities, a particular community together. So this could be a geographical community that is, maybe shares a neighborhood or an area, or it could be a community that is connected by a shared aspiration, a shared concern, a shared form of oppression or marginalization, a shared identity. Communities come together around all sorts of things, right? So it's bringing together a community to then, and an asset-based approach is where you start with what assets does this community have to address the oppression it's facing, or to work towards the aspirations it has. Right? So it's facilitating a community in sharing their stories and experiences and grievances and hopes with each other, because and seeing that as a form of pedagogy, right? It's a form of it's what Freire calls pedagogy of the oppressed. It's a form of critical consciousness building that happens when if you and I each have individual experiences of suffering, we tend to think of it as just our hardship, right? But then when we come together in communion with other people and can see that, hey, actually this is happening to you too, and me too, and you, so maybe it's not me that's the problem, right? Maybe I haven't, especially in the kind of context we are in, where so much of our suffering is framed as individual failure, right? As personal failure, rather than as a systemic, a structural responsibility. It then allows people to consider what structural and systemic issues are responsible for their suffering, and then to address that in ways that the community determines for itself. And yeah, I think that's the maybe.
And community development, that's sort of the process of improvement that you just described.
Yeah, where you then build competencies within a community to be able to participate in mutual aid, which is where people are doing things for each other, right? Meeting needs for each other, and at the same time drawing attention to how these are needs that they've been, or this is deprivation that's been caused because of structural failures, so that we build caring cultures in communities, and the development is in the creating of competencies and capacities that a community needs to be able to bring about the transformation it seeks, either through its own efforts that don't outside of the system, or through pushing for and through making demands for change politically.
And I think what it's how you describe it. It's really important to know that this is a deeply political process, right? It's the definition of political, in that you're organizing people to create change, positive change for themselves, for their community. And we have this concept that that community work should, especially in Singapore, should not be political, should be depoliticized. But any time that you're trying to think about scarce resources and how they should be allocated, And how do we make decisions about how we govern ourselves? That's the definition of political. So it's impossible to separate the two. And it's this very artificial divide in Singapore created by the PAP government, which I think has very negatively impacted a lot of our of not just our communities and how we live, but how we understand how we solve our problems. And we're never going to solve our problems till we understand that this is all deeply, deeply political, and there's no separating them.
Yes, and I think linking community organizing and development to political participation is crucial, right? So when you can demonstrate that people are actually coming together and able to take decisions, that's local self-governance, right? And then pushing for that to have political representation on a systemic and structural level, I think, is the next step.
So on that note, I want to talk about the death penalty in Singapore, since that's like one of the big issues that the Transformative Justice Collective is working on right now. And I guess the first question I want to ask is what's sort of the big issue with the death penalty? What's so harmful and bad and toxic about it?
Wow,
I mean, it's a huge thing. It's sort of this huge issue, and if you go online and you read up about the death penalty or you see articles, people point out many different things about it, right? They point out things like it costs the state more money, right? They talk about you can't get the life back, right? Second chances. They talk about how it empowers the state to take a life, right? But I think from somebody working from inside the movement, what would you say is something that's really, really toxic, really, really detrimental about the death penalty that maybe some of us don't recognize coming in from the outside?
Okay, so I can try to answer that I probably can't go into a very comprehensive response, but I'll try and do justice in a little, like a briefer answer. But also I think we need to reframe these questions, and I'll talk a bit about that. So firstly, I think that the death penalty is a form of structural violence that implicates all of society in extreme, irreversible violence against fellow people, right? And I think that it's a real trauma. I think there's collective trauma whenever we are party to violence in general, like whether it's judicial caning, whether it's even prison conditions in Singapore are a form of violence, whether it's the death penalty. And I think we as a society suffer collective trauma when we inflict violence on each other. And it pits people, this particular conception of justice pits people against each other rather than allowing us to relate to each other as fellow people and humans and to cooperate to address our shared suffering and shared aspirations, right? So it creates artificially two classes of people in society, right? These extreme criminals who deserve the worst, and then the rest of us, morally good people or better people. And I think it's extremely artificial as a starting point to how we conceive of what justice is, how we conceive of what harm is, and how we address harm as a society, right? So I think there are very practical arguments that have been made about costs and things like that, and then there are also philosophical and spiritual arguments about the sanctity of life. But I think one really important factor to consider is also that a disproportionate number of people who are incarcerated and are on death row are socioeconomically marginalized people, right? Socioeconomically and otherwise marginalized people who've experienced extreme suffering and injustice in their lives. And so to me, it is fundamentally punishing people, individuals, for our failures as a society to care for each other better, to be more equitable, and to be more humane, and to allow everyone a dignified life. So it's double the violence, right? Because you're first causing such immense suffering and deprivation to people, like deprivation of opportunity, of care, of fulfillment, and then you're also then depriving them of liberty through incarceration, and then depriving them of life, and then subjecting them to violence in the form of caning and things like that. So,
I mean, I really like that point that you made just now, in that it creates this binary, right? There's the normal people, law-abiding citizens, and then just these weird, extreme criminals on the other end, which is, insane, because we all do things for a reason, and the reasons are likely tied to, class and our position in society and even our ethnicity. So I really like that point. There's that false binary that's being created that I really never realized here. Right?
Yeah, and when we talk about the death penalty as just an ideological or abstract issue, then we're not talking about actually who it's being applied to, right?
Yeah.
Because it's like, is the death penalty good or bad? But like, for who and why? And why are they in this position? Like, we need to talk about all of that before we can talk about this. And I think when we also, of course, it's natural that when we have a certain set of conditions in society, then challenging the status quo becomes like where you need to prove and explain what's wrong with that and why it needs to change. But I actually think that we need to reframe the conversation as, but what is punishment for? Why did we come up with this? What is the history of punishment? And how have we come to conceptualize crime?
Yeah.
And how do we decide on what punishments for what types of crimes, and what are the values and understandings of how people work as individuals, and also how society works, that informs those decisions about punishment, right? So I think it's a really philosophical and first principles conversation that needs to happen simultaneously.
Yeah.
If I can pick up, one thing that suddenly occurs to me, what you said, is the massive cognitive dissonance with some of the, you talked about legitimizing extreme violence, right? And so I'm just responding to this without a particular sort of question, but it's suddenly strange to me that we're okay with hanging people and we're okay with caning people behind closed doors, but somehow, say, flogging someone in public, cutting the hand off of a thief, scarring someone for life, tattooing someone because they committed a crime. These are all punishments that have occurred throughout history, some of which still occur today, and are between caning someone in private and hanging someone, right? Why are we okay with these sort of two? They're not even, this is an extreme. This isn't really an extreme in the sense, but sort of 2 points of violence against a person. And yet all these things in between, somehow I would hazard that most people would regard them as barbaric. So there seems to be a very strange cognitive dissonance that just occurred to me, and I don't know why that is. It's just an observation.
Right. And I think also that, I think we will all have to think about the death penalty, while we think about it in terms of policy and structures of violence and all of that, there's also, I think, deeply personal reasons that we will come to for why we take the stance we do. And for me, one of them is, one of the reasons why the death penalty is, to me, the most unacceptable form of violence is because it is the most calculated, premeditated form of violence and murder, right? So if we are horrified by murder or violence or any other form of harm that people do because they are in a position that is desperate, or in a moment of passion and anger because of other vulnerabilities, or even because of they are driven by power or whatever it is in that moment, to me there is, how can we be horrified by that but accept the clinical premeditated form of murder that is capital punishment, right? There is no excuse that is a human excuse that you can say, oh, I was beyond myself, or I was, there is just no humanity in it, right? Because it is a clinical, mechanical act of ending someone's life, and so it is for me personally just really boggling that we can reject forms of violence that have a human motivation to them, but yet tolerate structural violence of that kind of mechanical, clinical nature.
Yeah. I mean, that to me, that's really a huge, crux of it, right? If we say murder is wrong, well, why is it then that some people get to murder in the name of retribution, and other people don't?
Exactly.
And are we? Why do we? Either murder is wrong or it's not.
Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you can't kill your wife because she, or your husband, or your child because they upset and angered you or did something unjust to you, then how can we kill people for doing something unjust? Like, it's just, it doesn't, there is no moral coherence to me too. And also I think that, going back to the point about this collective trauma, I think that a society that practices capital punishment and judicial caning cannot be a society that also is able to end domestic violence or end child abuse or end domestic worker abuse. Because if we are a violent society, then that is the culture we are encouraging on interpersonal levels too. So you can't stop a kid who's hitting another kid by hitting the kid. It doesn't really teach the kid that violence isn't acceptable, I think. Yeah.
Can I just ask you? You use the term collective trauma, right? Which, I mean, I get the sense of that, and I feel that whenever one of these idiotic exercises in state power occurs. But I see a lot of people who don't really care, who are just like, well, shouldn't have done that. Like, there's no trauma. It doesn't seem to register on any level. So can you explain the collective trauma and how it affects us? What is it? Yeah.
Well, I think maybe it's just a personal belief, right? But I think it's not just in terms of state violence, but I think that any kind of inequality, injustice, and violence in our society, we all bear a spiritual cost and an emotional cost for it, whether it's conscious or not, and maybe some of us to greater degrees and some of us to lesser degrees. But I think that, every time we have to reckon with the fact that 1 million migrant workers here live in indentured and otherwise exploitative conditions so that we can have clean streets, so that we can have malls, so that we can, be able to go out to work because we know our children and elderly are taken care of at home. I think that we all suffer a cost that we might not recognize in material ways, but I think that it's a cost to our humanity, right? And I think that if we care about, building caring cultures and generative cultures and cultures where we can both take care of other people and be taken care of, I think that all these forms of violence make it much harder for us to be full humans.
Yeah.
And we have to keep living with increasing cognitive dissonance, where we have to ignore, avoid, minimize, reframe, justify things that are actually, in fact, on a very deeply human level, painful to reckon with. I mean, I don't think that even people who can advocate for capital punishment can think of it as in any way as pleasant or as nourishing or nurturing, right? Like, it's at best, something that we justify intellectually or otherwise, but we are tolerating on a visceral level. It's how can we deny the trauma of that of other people's suffering that the people that we live alongside in society.
That clarifies it for me a lot, because I think I guess initially when I came into this, I sort of thought about trauma as this very visceral, horrifying, emotionally tumultuous effect that it would have on you. But then when you sort of brought up that subconscious dimension, you brought up sort of the spiritual or the more human or lived experience about it, then it does make a ton of sense, that there's an effect or an exercise in being callous, an exercise in being this detached creature, that sort of looks on and then can kind of be snarky about the death penalty or can talk about human life in terms of pure pragmatics or economics. So that falls into trauma as well. Like, trauma isn't just that that horrendous experience. It's that act of repressing or dissociating from the fact of the matter. So I love that.
And even interpersonally, I mean, even in terms of personal trauma, that's exactly how it shows up.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
People respond to trauma through cognitive dissonance, through blocking the memory, through denying the experience. I mean, those are all responses, very common responses to trauma.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and so there's kind of a big thing that we haven't yet touched on, that we can't sort of skip over when we're discussing the death penalty, and that's drugs, right? Illicit substances, which to me has always struck me as the most bizarre part of the death penalty in Singapore. Because, all right, let's say we are talking about retribution, right? Let's say we are talking about the old argument about an eye for an eye. All right, fine, I could sort of see how that's a kind of coherent thought. But the idea that somebody who trafficked drugs in, typically because they are from a low socioeconomic background or there was some kind of financial necessity to do so, that person should have their life taken away from them. That's the bit that I don't understand. So can you share with us some context? What is the relation between drugs and the death penalty in Singapore?
Well, I don't want to be a spokesperson for the government and their stance on it, but the way that they have, the narrative within which that sits is that this tough stance on drugs makes Singapore safer for all of us, that drugs destroy lives and families and communities, and drugs universally are always dangerous, and, that there is no distinction between different kinds of drugs and also different practices in terms of drug consumption. It's all painted in the most simplistic way that is not at all evidence-based or cognizant of social, structural, political factors that contribute to drug use and to drug trade. And it's also part of their hyper neoliberal pro-business environment narrative, right? That this is what is part of what makes Singapore clean. Right?
Yeah.
It's together with the sanitation, it's together with all of that. It's just like we're tough on crime, tough on drugs, and this is how we stay attractive to investors and how we make sure that all of you are safe on the streets and that your children are safe from these looming predators looking to sell your children drugs. Right? That's their narrative, but I hate to have to
it's so much
that,
hypocrisy. it just annoys me because it's so much hypocrisy, and I don't want to preempt what you're gonna say, but I just get really annoyed by that because we permit alcohol, we permit gambling, and you're telling me those things don't destroy lives. You need some consistency here, and alcohol destroys way more lives than drugs. Gambling, it's a lot more limited in Singapore, so I don't know, but I feel very confident saying I'm sure alcohol has destroyed way more lives than gambling. Why do we not say restrict it in some way? Why is that? And then again, the hypocrisy, the hyper neoliberal capitalism. We permit companies which have drug products to operate in Singapore and have, say, regional headquarters, right? We permit companies which produce products which destroy lives to operate here because we're okay with living off the profits of drugs if those drugs damage other people's lives, but we don't want the drugs to come in and damage our lives. But we're okay with making money from the drugs if the drugs are elsewhere and the companies are here making money and operating regional headquarters, and we can take our cut off in the form of tax. So it's just massive hypocrisy, and it's also a very ideologically derived position,
Exactly.
which runs counter to the whole narrative. Oh, we're pragmatic. No, if you were pragmatic, then you'd have a much more logical and reasonable policy towards drugs and its management. You wouldn't just ban it and murder people who knowingly or unknowingly traffic it. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so that's exactly it, right? This government is a very, it makes its policies ideologically and not based on evidence or anything like that. And I think it's also political theater, right? Because you pick an issue, and then that's why the hypocrisy shows up, right? Because it's not really even an ideological position they're committing to consistently or all the way. It's just like it's the same way that they carry out raids on brothels as political theater, right? To show that we're cleaning up the city, we're keeping the city clean, and you need us because without us, all these dangers are lurking. So there are certain bogeymen, and sex work is one, and drugs are another, and these are all tools I think that this government uses to build its political capital, and in the sense of dependence that they want citizens to feel on them as necessary for people to feel safe and live in this society with a certain level of well-being, right? So I think they choose these bogeymen, and then lots of people's lives are deeply affected and sacrificed as a result of this political theater and this infantilizing approach to people.
I remember one time, like in this introductory philosophy class in college, they sort of brought up this idea, okay, what if we sold 10% of our children to slavery and then 90% of the population could live this extremely happy life? And then everybody said, no, what on earth are you saying? It's horrible. And then the next scenario given is, well, what if we kill if we kill people who brought drugs in or harmful substances in? And everybody's like, good. That's the way it should be, right? And so we can sort of stand back and we can sort of take a bird's eye view and laugh at the situation. Haha, it's so incoherent. But I'm just curious, how did this position get so entrenched? Because these are bright, intelligent people, but they've kind of bought into this very profound contradiction. How did this happen? Do you have any thoughts or guesses? We have a historian here and we have a death penalty activist. It's amazing because how did this happen? This is such a huge contradiction here.
A potted history is that one of the PAP's great successes was actually cleaning up organized crime and opium, which was very destructive to Singapore in the 50s and 60s. So the PAP, of course, came to power in 59 and were very much dedicated to stopping organized crime. To understand this, you have to remember Singapore was very much, throughout our history, been this frontier port, right? And if you think of, one analogy I like to make is Pirates of the Caribbean and the East India Company and the pirates. And Singapore, we were the pirates, right? We were Tortuga, where anything goes. You could get any sorts of services for any sorts of money. And we were this great frontier port of the British Empire where all this money, but all these vices sloshed through, right? Raffles famously tried to ban gambling and prostitution, and then the moment he left, Farquhar brought it back. Why? Because a port needs those things, a free port needs those things to thrive. And as Singapore became more sophisticated and slowly over the years started to have its own resident population who were born here and grew up here, and then developed economically and then eventually industrialized, we still remained this very much freewheeling frontier port. In the 50s, we were still called Sin Galore, because the idea was if you can't get it in Singapore, you can't get it anywhere, right? And we're famous Bugis Street, right, for the nightlife and the kind of vices that were available to people. And that was all a natural part of our growth. And so the problem is, as people start getting born here and grow up here and their children are growing up here, they want this to end, and they want a lot more, cleaner streets, vices hidden away. They want a better environment to grow up in. But it also, the kind of crime that we had in the 60s was a massive, massive problem. Shootouts in the streets, right? We also called the Chicago of the East. So it's not like it was unique to us, of course. Organized crime was a problem in major American cities. It was a problem here. And so the PAP took a lot of very tough measures to clean this up, including the criminal, the Temporary Provisions Act, right? We have two laws in Singapore that permit detention without trial. The ISA was aimed at communists, although whether any actual communists were actually arrested under it remains subject to debate. But the Criminal Law Temporary Provisions Act was aimed at secret society members. And Lee Kuan Yew took a really, really tough position of what we'd call today zero tolerance, and just arrested anyone with any sort of secret society, organized crime, drugs, and made minor concessions to things which had to go on, like alcohol, but he banned gambling, or he made it a government monopoly, and banned drugs. And I don't know if it's still true today, but when you go into NS, you have to report if you have any tattoos, right? So I had to say I have a tattoo, right, of my university athletic logo, right, which I got in university.
Oh my God, such a
Really?
geek, PJ.
Yeah.
Okay, this is new to me. All right.
Yeah, but the reason for that is secret societies. So that's where it comes from, and then we get into today, where the PAP over the years has become deeply entrenched into certain ideological positions, and you can only advance within the PAP if you subscribe to those positions. And of course, the current Prime Minister is the son of Lee Kuan Yew. He's not going to deviate from his father's legacy. In fact, of course, as we've seen through Oxley Road, he's trying to put his father's legacy on a pedestal to protect it, to protect the PAP, and to protect their political interests. So that's kind of where we are today, in that we can't have an honest conversation because we are too deeply our political leadership is too deeply tied into a certain legacy and an ideological position, and cannot get away with it, because the moment they get away with it, well, then why would you vote for the PAP, right? Their whole argument is we have, SG50, SG54, we have all these years of governing Singapore successfully, and that is Lee Kuan Yew, right? What can Lee Hsien Loong say, what can Goh Chok Tong really say about their premierships, apart from the fact that, we maintain the great achievements of Lee Kuan Yew and keep Singapore where it is today. So this is the quandary they face. I've talked about this in other podcasts, lectures, whatever. And this is, I think, in a nutshell, why we're so deeply trapped in certain positions, ideological positions. And then, of course, they can present that as pragmatism, as, just continuing what is the easiest thing to do. Of course, because they are the ones who've been doing it, right? But it's only pragmatic in the sense that it's the status quo, but it's not pragmatic in any sense of actually looking at evidence and deciding what is the what reflects reality.
And also, I think that's a really helpful, grounding point to look at and make sense of a lot of their policies and the way that they approach issues universally, right? Dr. Stephanie Chalk has studied and published a paper on how these particular drug laws came into being, which I have forgotten what the reasons were, but that's a good resource to kind of understand how the death penalty was introduced for drugs. But I just want to also point out that, friends who study social history of Singapore have pointed out that it's incredible that in Singapore in the last, 100 years or whatever, not much has changed in terms of social history, right? And I think that's also partly because this government is so tied to a particular legacy and a way of looking at issues. But if you take, for example, the drug issue, right? Have you guys been on the Singapore River cruise? It's like a tourist thing to do, so you may not have.
I think I remember.
Yeah, but when you're on the boat, right, the voiceover is talking all about how there were, this area was so filthy with and all these opium dens and brothels, and then the PAP cleaned it all up. And so this is such a big part of their political capital and narrative too, right? That they have cleaned this up. So then it's part of keeping in that legacy. But also, what is so striking to me about that history is also that, well, the opium dens existed because there were extremely overworked workers who were working in ridiculously taxing conditions and had really poor living conditions and used drugs to cope, right? And that's very much also still real today, where the men I've interviewed who've been to the drug rehabilitation center, which is absolutely not rehabilitative, or who have used drugs, a lot of them say that they started because of very taxing work conditions, right? Because they had to work for 14 hours at a stretch or through the night and do really demanding labor, and that to cope, their colleagues were using meth or whatever it was, and then they started using it because that's the only way they could get through the day. So, I think that this approach was always, again, to not transform the structural reasons or address why these things were happening, because people especially when people are doing things that might harm them, they're doing them because they're in a position of desperation, or because the alternative is worse. That's usually why people do things that might be risky to their well-being, right? Because the alternative is unthinkable, or in many ways makes them more vulnerable. So instead of addressing those things, the government's always taken I think a very inhumane approach.
And if I can add, what you've reminded me of is the reason why a lot of people were addicted to opium, of course, is the British government was happy to encourage that. They got a nice tax of it, right? The whole point of the wars with China was to force China to accept opium, because so much currency, silver, was draining out of Britain because Britain was buying China's tea. They needed a product to counterbalance that. So they forcibly addicted China to opium by invading it and forcing open their ports and forcing that in. And Singapore, of course, was the port founded to service that trade, right? It is a fact that for most of our history, our economy has been built on three major products: drugs, slaves, and alcohol. And that was definitely true throughout the 19th century and into the 20th. And today, it's and when we say slaves, of course, we include indentured labor with very unequal contracts. So it's kind of similar things still going on today.
Yep.
We're still built and we're still taking big taxes of vices, of human exploitation of humans, right? All these incredibly horrific things. And yet the government somehow says it's holding the high moral ground. I mean, no, it's not.
Well, I mean, I want to pick up on something that you briefly mentioned just now. What goes on in drug rehab if it's not rehabilitative?
So it's exactly like prison.
Okay.
It is within the prison compound, right? It's just another...
Why call it rehab?
So the only difference is that, so again, that's detention without trial too, right? Because the Misuse of Drugs Act allows the state to detain people for consumption of drugs there's no trial. So they just go into DRC, and the only difference is that there's no criminal record. That's the main thing that's changed. So it's rehab in that you don't get a criminal record, but the conditions are identical, and they have to go through some kind of program, like just classes or lessons that also exist in prison. But there's a selection of courses that one could go through, right? Anger management, whatever. So I think in DRC it's probably about drug-related things, but none of the guys I've spoken to have found it in the least bit relevant or helpful to their recovery or well-being. So
it seems odd that a rehab would be something you get forcibly sent into, because a rehab is something you check yourself into. You rehabilitate yourself. That's a bit strange.
So we
though.
do have NAMS, the National Addiction Management Service. So that's at IMH. And you could check yourself in there.
Wait, did you just say it's at the Institute of Mental Health?
Yes, it's an IMH wing.
That's a bit strange also, right? Because it's not a mental health issue. It's usually right.
Well, it's a public health issue, right?
Yeah.
And it does have.
So
I mean, it is psychiatrists that look at addiction.
Yeah.
Isn't it? So it is. To that extent, it's not... I mean, of course, then they're not addressing structural systemic factors, but that's true for all of healthcare, right? Like people get diabetes for structural reasons too. People get depressed for structural reasons. Hospitals and mental health care facilities are not set up to respond to those, but they can support with addiction. And that is, in fact, a progressive approach, right? To treat it as a healthcare issue. And so they're... so because addiction then is there's, I'm not an expert, but we're actually, so today is the 5th of December, is it? And on the 13th, in commemoration of Human Rights Day, we're having a panel, a Transformative Justice Collective is having a panel on drug policy, on drug use, like what are the drivers of drug use, and also what are the how addiction works,
Yeah.
right? So we're having doctors and researchers who study drug use, and also someone who has experienced, excuse me, both DRC and NAMS, and other forms of support and intervention, share his experience as well. So
Will that be recorded?
yes, it will be recorded.
Okay, so we'll put it in the show notes because this won't come out till January. So we'll put it in the show notes so
Yeah.
people can immediately go from this to that and watch that.
Yeah, so there, I think they will go into more of how addiction really works and how, both also like why people start to use drugs, but then
Yeah.
once they start to use drugs, what's actually helpful, right? And I think that the progressive practices around the world that have seen a lot of effective change
Yeah.
is a harm reduction approach
Yes.
that focuses on giving people a safe space and a safe way to use, and also medication that helps them to wean off the drug that they're addicted to, and
Yeah.
really by treating it as a healthcare issue. Yeah.
You know, one of the big things that I feel like I've learned in this discussion here, right, is that we've really, you know, through the death penalty and to support the death penalty simultaneously, constructed these cultures of retribution, and that human life is pragmatic, and that this violence is necessary, and it's all right, and it's okay for us to all condone this kind of violence, right? So we have this culture of retribution, of a punitive society, right? What's the alternative here? How do we imagine a non-violent and restorative culture?
Yeah, so that's not going to come from any state, right?
Okay.
So we have to do that work. And I think a lot of it is deep unlearning,
Yeah.
right? As much as it is experimenting with and learning other ways of being with each other. And I think I don't want to sound cheesy, right? But I think it starts with, you know, even things like how we treat ourselves, how we treat the people in our lives, or whether they're our family or friends or people we work with, and resisting the deeply violent and capitalist mode of being with each other that I
Yeah.
think our systems and structures and the way we've organized societies in urban capitalist societies tends to indoctrinate or condition us to. So I think it's a lot of unlearning and I think being committed to understanding how to care for each other better,
Yeah.
and focusing on collective accountability,
Yeah.
right, for harm.
Yeah.
That when whether it's gender-based violence or other forms of harm that exist in our society,
Yeah.
at the same time that we understand that individuals are responsible for the choices they make, simultaneous awareness of our collective responsibility for creating the conditions within which these forms of harm thrive,
Yeah.
and how we are complicit in that, and then revisiting what we can do
Yeah.
to create a different kind of culture, right? That allows people to be gentle with each other,
Yeah.
and to be caring towards each other, and to cooperate rather than compete. You know, these are all the kinds of the ethic of a hyper-capitalist society, right? Of getting ahead, or of a zero-sum kind of relationship between different groups of people, of being intolerant to difference. And I think like resisting all of that happens at a deeply personal level, as well as seeking out support in doing that. And along the way, recognizing that we will screw up and we will cause harm. And how would we like to be held accountable? Like when we want to think about how to address harm in society, I think it's a helpful way to start by thinking about how would we like to be held accountable when we cause harm,
Yeah.
right? And then even things like starting with what is a meaningful way to apologize? What is a meaningful way to put things right? And when we are hurt, what is it that we want from people? Like if you talk to most, many people who experience, say, domestic violence
Yeah.
or sexual violence, like it's so often what people want is acknowledgement of the harm that's been caused, for their experience to be heard, and for some form of reparation, right? And some form of reassurance that this behavior will not be repeated towards them or towards other people. Now, the criminal justice system we have is not set up to facilitate any of this, right? Because largely it looks at harm as state versus person, right? Not you and me. Like if you hurt me, I'm actually irrelevant to the criminal justice process. I'm just possibly a witness, right? But it is actually you versus the state, because it's considered an act of harm against the state, because what we focus on is that you've broken a law. What institutions, like what we've seen with, NUS or other institutions recently, focus on is that you've broken a rule. That's why it's misconduct, right? So it's about the violation of the code that the country or the institution comes up, not harm that a human has experienced, which is the whole point, right? Which should be what is centered, is that someone or some people or a community has been hurt, and how do we put that right, and what is it that community needs to heal?
I get these like emails from NUS now, and then they'll put like the rules that the person broke, in these sexual assault cases, and I just find that so weirdly amusing and depressing at the same time, because who cares that you broke a rule? You traumatized somebody. I don't care which rule or which law you're flouting. It's a human being. Okay, but
yeah, it's this idea that if we just have better laws, better rules, that all these problems will go away. And I don't think we do enough in Singapore. Well, that's an understatement, really. But to think about the values that we want as a society, that we're promoting. And you can clearly see in other places which obsess about rules-based approach to things, where people become overly focused on how to manipulate those rules to be technically correct, but to your greatest advantage, right? And I think the best example is how America treats its democracy right now, where you're technically legal but highly immoral. But the argument of people say, oh, it's legal. I followed the rules. And you can't create a society purely based on rules. There has to be values and norms. And in order to have those values and norms, you have to debate. You have to have people feel safe enough to speak out, to give their opinion. You need to think about the short and long-term consequences of those values and norms. Right? But unfortunately, we don't get any of that in Singapore. Instead, we just get this relentless, let's have more rules. And you have a government whose ideology is, we just need good enough rules and we will solve the problem. Right? And what is a good enough rule? Well, it is one which, and increasingly they've resorted to rules which give the government so much power in so many different ways to arbitrarily decide things that then means that they can just fix everything in theory. Of course, and POFMA is one example, right? If you can literally decide the truth, then of course you can fix any problem. But then, of course, the ability of those laws to be abused for all sorts of, or just mistakes to happen is immense. And it's not going to address the underlying issue that we have a problem with fake news, and people are not being trained to understand, there's no media literacy education. There's a incentive structure that incentivizes the creation and spread of fake news. None of that's being addressed. It's just give the government more laws, more power, and this is again an overarching structural problem.
Yeah, and if you follow the kind of narrative that the government's been putting out in lieu of I think increasing scrutiny of how the criminal justice system operates, they keep emphasizing that. That they decide who to prosecute on the basis of public interest, right? But this is a really interesting thing to grapple with for me, because whose interest is it in to prosecute a domestic worker in a really vulnerable position for theft from a really wealthy family? I mean, there is, of course, in let's say Parthi Leonie's case, it's clear that she is innocent and did not steal. But I've often wondered, why do we as a society place so much more value on the theft that people who are poor and in vulnerable positions commit, for lack of a better word, against, say, businesses like let's say, with shoplifting or against employers or whatever. And at the same time, we are so tolerant of wage theft, which is a far more harmful form of theft. Because if I'm a domestic worker and I take $10 from you or a few shirts, it's taken so much more seriously by our criminal justice system. When every day we are stealing from domestic workers just by not paying them enough, just by the conditions that we subject them to living in, and we don't see that as a form of theft. And when there's actual, even and that's a bit more of a abstract notion of theft, right? But even if you took concrete instances of migrant workers who've been deprived of a year's salary, 2 years' salary, who've not had their injury claims reimbursed or provided for by the company. At most, what the government, what MOM will facilitate through the labor court justice approach is a few months compensation, right? If and when it can be proven, if the worker has evidence that there was wage theft, that they weren't given their salary for these many months, or that they were shortchanged, usually a case like that can take 3 years, right? And then all that time the worker doesn't have any wages, and at the end the settlement, it's a settlement, right? Not a penalty. And the settlement is usually 50% of what they were owed to begin with. And if that's the approach, then why aren't domestic workers made to give back $5 when they steal $10? So whose interest is that in, right? So I think a lot of the ways that our laws and policies are enforced, it's not just about this notion that if we have better rules and refine it, it will be fine. Because that's still, you could say, it's a frustratingly technocratic, but maybe well-intentioned or innocent approach. But I find it actively malicious and harmful because it is clearly in the interest of wealthy people, clearly in the interest of protecting the privileges of people who are already in power. Right? And it is not at all in the public interest. And I find it deeply offensive that would be claimed, right? That it is in the public interest. It is in the public interest that workers are paid fair wages. That's what's in the public interest, right? Not protecting extremely wealthy people from petty theft. And that you would put so much state resources into that, a 4-year trial, it's mind-blowing.
I think it's important to emphasize as well. This is true for everyone, and not just domestic workers, in that if you steal from your employer's workplace, right, they can report you for theft and call the police. If they don't pay you your fair wages, and this happens to freelancers all the time, right, for months, you're told, go arbitration, mediation.
Small claims tribunal,
tribunal. Why can't you just file a police report for theft too? It is a form of theft.
Exactly. And there's so many people, and do you know, I recently found out that there's so many people who go through the small claims tribunal and all these forms of mediation and things like that for years, right? And then they actually get a court order directing the employer to pay them the unpaid wages, whether this is a full-time job at a company or freelance work or whatever. And that is not enforceable.
What?
Right? It's just a direction by the court to them to pay. But if they don't, right, it's not like they're directly culpable of any offense. Then you have to go through a whole other process to then, I think, get then there's another kind of function whereby you can get somebody to seize their property or do things like that to get them to compensate, where you have to then take the things and then sell it to get the money. It's just mind-blowing. I might not have all the details done, but this is the general way that it works, right?
I already thought it was bad that a freelancer had to put in unpaid labor to get remuneration. The unpaid labor being going to the small claims tribunal, filling out a ton of paperwork, and then reliving the trauma of this asshole didn't pay me, and now I need to go and see this person again, and then all of that unpaid. I thought that was bad enough. Now you're telling me it's just a direction.
Yeah.
Oh God. Okay.
And this reminds you of something else, right? We as a society and our government obsess over people who abuse the welfare system, right? CPF. But these are the most vulnerable people in society who are desperate and struggling and have all sorts of challenges. But the government's happy to expose people who are this person gets so much welfare, and they say it's not enough. But there are so many people who are tax evaders, right? Who, through all sorts of legal means, they stash their money abroad and they don't pay their fair share of tax. And this is worth way more to the public treasury, way more money to our taxes than welfare cheats.
So it's also a question of who this government trusts, right? So it's really, I think, striking to me that when it comes to individuals and vulnerable people, then their stance is always to mistrust, and then to design policies and mechanisms to protect against gaming the system.
Yeah.
But then when you ask them to, say, implement anti-discrimination laws, you ask them to, say, introduce workplace sexual harassment related policies and laws, then they will say, no, we will provide guidelines because we want the companies to rise to that. We don't want to use enforcement. So then who is it that you trust and to not game the system, right? Because so many companies continue to practice discrimination. So many landlords continue to practice discrimination, and so many workplaces have rampant bullying, harassment, and all sorts of things. And is that gaming the system? Would we ever frame it that way? Because there's no rule, right? So there is this sense of good faith towards wealthy people, again, towards corporations, towards people who are already in positions of power, and an immense disdain for and mistrust of people who are in vulnerable positions, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I just want to sort of put one last question. I mean, it's been an amazing content-rich interview here, but I want to just sort of put to you one last abstract question that everybody on the show gets, and that's, what's your theory of change? And you can answer it however you like. Whether you think that means the change that you want to make on a personal level. How do you think change should happen? How do you think change will happen? How do you want the change to look like? And what are some things that we need to take note of when we're thinking about change? You can answer it however you like. But I just want to know, what are your thoughts on a theory of change? Maybe personally, because you've been through so many groups. You've been through, not groups, but you've been involved with so many causes. You've been with women's rights. You've been with education, beyond social services. Now you're working with the death penalty. What's the change that you want to make on a personal level? It doesn't seem tied to any one particular cause. Yeah. But what is that change that you want to see, Oh
gosh. so okay. Well, I think that to me it's maybe about people and the communities that I care about, but also people at large, in the people we share this world with and this society with, having the opportunity to be alive to the realities, the socio-political and other realities of our shared existence, and being able to have a say in shaping it, right? So I think that that's probably a focus in my mind, because I think in Singapore we're so deprived and denied of that wave of being alive to what it means to be a citizen. Like I think we're so often the identity that is allowed for us in the society is one of a consumer, one of a worker, one of a professional, or like a beneficiary, a client, and they're all identities that are determined by institutions. But I think that what I would call our life world is relating to each other as fellow people, as neighbors, as members in a shared community and in a shared aspiration. And I think becoming alive to that and to shaping our everyday life, like what should be ours, I think in terms of public resources, like being able to claim that, so that we're not held hostage to the state and its whims about who deserves what, and being able to provide and create things for each other and demand of the state what is ours and stake that claim is, I think, the work that I feel committed to.
Yeah.
And how to do that, I think is for me partly. I mean, I think any kind of short answer to that will necessarily be reductive and simplistic. But at the risk of that, I guess one way to put it is I think trying to force open those spaces that the state has denied us, right?
Yeah.
So being able, like, creating spaces where we can come together as people and to grapple with the questions that should be ours to grapple with and not theirs.
Yeah.
And to find the answers that are ours and not where we are deferring to them. And to challenge each other and cooperate with each other and take care of each other as we do that. Yeah. Then creating those spaces is how I see my work.
What's the biggest thing you think we need to be mindful about when we're pushing for, fighting for change? Because you kind of really showed me a new perspective today with this idea of the decentralized movement building, the idea that the professionalization of activism is not all sunshine and rainbows. There's a dark side to it as well. The idea that, we need to think carefully about the dark side and the good side of activism as well. So I just want to know, what is one thing that you want people to be more mindful about while they're pushing for or fighting for change?
Can I say two things?
Yes, okay. You can say as many things as you like. Yeah.
Okay, so I think one thing that I've been trying to learn and practice is that we can't only tell people what we don't want. We need to create a vision of what we want.
Yeah.
Right? So because I think that the energy of resistance, of negation is can be quite exhausting, right? And it's draining, and it doesn't really always mobilize or bring us together. I think people need, we all of us need to know what it is that, and to be able to create a vision together of this is actually what we want, right? So when we say we don't want this, we don't want this, we don't want this, and this is bad, and this is unjust, and this is violent, we're saying also that this is what we want instead. And I think that sometimes we forget that, even though of course that's what informs why we're fighting this, right? They're not binaries, but I think that it can get lost in the communication because what we're trying to end or fight seems so urgent that we fixate on that. But I think people in imagination and hearts and are inspired by what we could have instead, by making that seem possible.
Yeah.
Right. And the other thing is of course, I'm sure this is something that is commonly being talked about in civil society now, so I think that's really great. But I think it's valuable enough to reinforce or repeat, is that being mindful of building inclusive movements, right? That are accessible to people at the margins of and who live at the intersections of multiple marginalities. And I don't think it's only, and when I say that, I don't mean that we create movements and then we make them accessible, but that we ensure that it is people who experience multiple marginalities, whose leadership we look to in movement building, whose wisdom and tools and practices and ways of coming together that we look to and learn from and participate in. So it's not like we create projects and then get people to participate in it, right? But that we see what is it that people are already doing for themselves, and there's constant innovation at the margins in terms of people coming up with solutions and ways to creatively resist their conditions and to survive and thrive in those conditions, and then see how can we support those efforts and put more resources, energy, and attention towards those efforts and learn from those spaces. That's why I think those are two things.
All right, Kokila, thank you so much for coming on the show. Yeah, it's been really, really, really enlightening. I mean, you've changed my mind on a couple of issues. You showed me another side of things. And I mean, I just want to thank you for coming on to talk to us, and as well as the constant and consistent work that you've been doing for activism in Singapore. I think that's really, really amazing.
No, thank you. This was a whole lot of fun. And I think, so very often we're working and doing things and engaging in action, and it's really valuable to have spaces where we can step back and talk to each other and make sense and make meaning of our work, right? So thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks, Koki. I mean, you're not just inspiring, you're one of the most relentlessly joyful people that I know. I don't know how you continue to exude joy in spite of all that's happened to you, but I'm so grateful to you. I'm so inspired for you, and I'm so thankful I live in a world with you in it.
Aww. Same. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, and on that, thank you, Sean, as always.
Thanks
Great
for having me,
questions,
yeah.
great co-hosting, and thank you to you, our audience, for joining us. And as always, if you enjoyed this, please do join New Narrative as a member, newnarrative.com/join, or you can donate at newnarrative.com/donate. We really do need your support. So thank you very much, and see you next time.
Please stay where you are. We've come way too far. Where you think that you're gonna go? This is utopia. Please stay where you are. We've come way too